So, a polar covalent bond produces partial charges in a molecule. In H2O, in water, oxygen has the higher electronegativity compared to hydrogen, so that covalent bond between those two atoms has unequal, uneven, asymmetrical sharing of the electron pair. The oxygen pulls the electrons close and farther away from the hydrogen. The oxygen pulls the electrons in and becomes partially negative. The hydrogen is now farther away from the electron pair and becomes partially positive. So because water contains polar covalent bonds, because water contains partial charges, water is a polar molecule. Now, nonpolar covalent bonds do not produce partial charges. So in a molecule like CH4, which is methane, the carbon and the hydrogen have equal electronegativity, approximately. In other words, the electron pairs are being shared equally between that carbon and those 4 hydrogens. No partial charges in that molecule. So methane is a non-polar molecule. Covalent bonds are the bonds that build molecules, that join atoms together and build molecules inside living cells. But there are other bonds inside living cells that we also need to be familiar with. Other connections between atoms, including what are called ionic bonds. Now that word ion just means an atom that has either lost or gained an electron. Remember, every element has a certain number of electrons associated with it. So sometimes atoms can lose a couple of those electrons or gain a couple new electrons. And along with that comes a charge. Recall that we said in a neutral atom, the number of protons and the number of electrons is the same. So the positive charge of the proton and the negative charge of the electrons cancel each other out, and the atom has no charge associated with it. Now, if we were to take away one of those electrons, suddenly there's one fewer electron than there are protons. So that atom now has a positive charge associated with it. Let's say we had 6 protons, 6 positive charges, and 6 electrons, 6 negative charges to start with. And then one of those electrons got lost. Now we have 6 positive charges and 5 negative charges. So overall, we have a plus charge on that atom. That's what's being depicted here on this sodium atom. When a sodium atom loses an electron, it becomes a sodium ion. It has one extra positive particle in it than it used to have. So now it has a positive charge. Compare that to the chloride atom below it. Sometimes chloride gains an electron, an extra electron. Now it has one more negative charge than it used to have. Now it has a negative charge associated with it. Now it's an ion. So an ion that forms from the loss of an electron is called a cation. An ion that forms from the gain of an electron is called an anion. When two ions form a bond between them, we call that an ionic bond. So what holds sodium and chloride together is an ionic bond. Something to know about ionic bonds: they are not as strong as covalent bonds. That explains why when we take sodium chloride and we drop it into water, for example, it will ionize. The ionic bond that is holding it together will break, and we'll get Na plus and Cl minus. That's what's depicted in the drawing on this slide. Here's a sodium atom. You can see the Na symbol in the center that's drawn over the top of the atomic nucleus. And then you can see 3 electron shells around that nucleus and pairs of electrons sitting in orbitals in those shells. In the valence shell, the outermost shell, there's an unpaired electron. This is not stable. So 2 things could happen. Either you could find a pair for this unpaired electron, you could find another electron that could be shared, or this electron can be sort of jettisoned, it can be lost, it can be taken away from that atom. And in fact, that's what happens with sodium. Now, once that electron is lost, we've taken away its charge. We've taken away its minus charge, its negative charge. So now we've created a positive ion. It has 1 more proton than electron. So it has a positive charge. And if you look, you don't even see that outermost shell anymore because there are no electrons in it. It has lost an electron. Down at the bottom, we see a chloride ion being formed. Here's the atomic nucleus. Here are the shells surrounding it. You can see that in the valence shell, there are actually 1, 2, 3 pairs in orbitals, but then there's 1 unpaired electron right here. So again, this atom could form a covalent bond in theory and share an electron with another atom. That would solve this unpaired problem. It could lose that electron, or it could gain an electron from another source. And in fact, it's the third thing that happens. As sodium loses its electron, chloride gains it. Chloride takes it in. Now it has a pair there. Now it's more stable. So it depends on the elements that you're talking about and their particular chemistry that determines whether or not they will ionize. And sodium chloride, it turns out, will ionize when you put it into water. The ionic bond that holds the sodium and the chloride together will break, and we will get Na plus and Cl minus. There are 2 other bonds that we also need to be familiar with. Now, these 2 are significantly weaker than covalent bonds. They're not even technically bonds, even though one of them has bond in its name. They are more correctly referred to as weak attractions between 2 atoms, or 2 regions of a molecule being drawn to each other. The first one is called a hydrogen bond, and the second one is called van der Waals interactions. So we need to understand the chemistry of these 2 bonds because we see these a lot in living cells. All a hydrogen bond is a weak attraction between 2 atoms or 2 regions of a molecule that pulls them together because there are partial charges in those regions that are drawn to each other. So it's an attraction between partially charged things, polar things, right? If there is a region of a molecule that is partially positive, it will be attracted to a region of another molecule, or even the same molecule, that's partially negative. Partial positive will be drawn to partial negative, and they will form a hydrogen bond. Now, this bond got its name because one of the members of the bond is going to be a hydrogen atom. I'll show you that in just a minute. Now, where do we see hydrogen bonding? The DNA molecule is the most obvious example in a living cell. Remember, DNA is a double-stranded molecule in a living cell. So we have a strand with bases coming off of it, and we have a second strand with bases coming off of it. We know that an adenine base on one strand, will be attracted to a T, a thymine base on the second strand. And what pulls the A and the T together and holds them together is a hydrogen bond, or bonds. We also know that G for guanine and C for cytosine are drawn to each other in the double helix of DNA. They're going to be pulled together and held together with hydrogen bonds. You can also find hydrogen bonds in proteins, and you can find hydrogen bonding between the head regions of the bilayer that makes up the cell membrane. Now, what about van der Waals interactions? Van der Waals interactions are also weak attractions between two molecules or two parts of the same molecule that are non-polar in their chemistry. So it's an attraction between two non-polar regions. Now, where do we find van der Waals interactions? You can find them in proteins, and you can find them holding together the tails in the bilayer of the cell membrane. Let's go back to water for a minute. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a water molecule drawn. The red circle represents oxygen. The white circles represent hydrogens. There's a black line drawn between them. That's a covalent bond. And there's a pair of electrons inside each of those covalent bonds. You'll notice that the artist has drawn the electrons right alongside the oxygen to remind us that this is a polar covalent bond. This is a polar covalent bond. The oxygen has a higher electronegativity than the hydrogen, so it pulls the electrons closer to it, and that creates partial charges. The oxygen becomes partially negative because it's close to those negatively charged electrons. The hydrogens become partially positive because they have lost their closeness to those negative electrons. And we create this partially charged polar molecule. Now, what happens when you bring a bunch of water molecules together? You bring a bunch of molecules that contain partial charges together, and you get hydrogen bonding. The partially negative oxygen atom will be attracted to, drawn to, the partially positive hydrogen atom of another water molecule. And what will connect them, what will hold them together, is not a true bond. It's an attraction. We call it a hydrogen bond, but it's nothing like a covalent bond. Now notice how the artist has drawn this, because this is how it's depicted in textbooks. It's a dotted line. It's a dotted line connecting those two atoms, and in fact the artist has shown it highlighted in yellow. Now, why do we care about all this? Let's do a check-in for a minute. Living organisms contain relatively few elements, right? We said 96% of their mass is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. That's it. All of those 4 elements will combine to make 96% of the molecules that you'll find in that cell. So we care about those 4 elements. We need to understand them a little bit. We need to know how many bonds they can make, how many covalent bonds they can make. Those few types of elements, those 4 elements, are going to combine in different ways to make all of the amazingly varied structural components inside a cell and inside the body of a multicellular organism. It's that very complicated molecular structure that then allows that cell or that organism to have all of the many different physiological processes that it needs to survive every day. So all of the metabolic things that go on inside a living cell, whether it's a microbial cell or some other kind of cell, are completely dependent upon those 4 elements when you get down to it. And because all living things on our planet are water-based, it's important for us to understand how the elements combine in terms of bonding together or being attracted to each other, and how they act when they're exposed to water. Every single cell is full of water. So the chemistry of the molecules in a cell is critically important in terms of how it's going to behave in that watery environment.